I'm Dick Levinson. On behalf of the Senior Center here at Central, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our program this morning. Our focus today is going to be on travel and tourism in 19th century England. And this is something that started as a very limited, restricted, elite kind of thing. But as the years of the century ticked on, eventually it evolved into what we would recognize as mass tourism. How did that happen? Our guest this morning is Dr. Alex Chase-Levenson. He is a historian from the University of Pennsylvania, and sadly, not related to me. I'll be introducing him in just a couple minutes, but before I do, there are a couple of points I want to touch on briefly. First, a gentle reminder that you can ask Dr. Chase-Levenson a question at any point during the proceedings this morning. Just look for the special Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can type a question for him there. He's already indicated that he's happy to answer audience questions, but won't do so until he's completed his presentation this morning. Secondly, I wanted to say something about what we as a community have been through over the past year and a half. But frankly, it's been awful. And that's why I take great pleasure in announcing now that as of Wednesday, September 22nd, we will return to our original mission of producing in-person, live talks and lectures where you can actually meet the speaker and everyone can look everybody else in the eye. Now, to celebrate our liberation from this little box, we will be presenting a very special program on the 22nd of September. It's called Oklahoma, the show that changed the history of American musical theater forever. Our guest for that program will be Dr. Christine White. She is with the Boyer School of Music at Temple University. And I wanted to mention that Mike Todd, the great American showman and producer, and some of you know that he was once married to Elizabeth Taylor, actually walked out of a pre-Broadway production of Oklahoma. And when somebody asked him what was wrong with the show, he was pretty direct and forthright. He said, "No legs, no jokes, no chance." Well, I'm happy to say that Mike Todd was wrong. And on September 22nd, we'll have an opportunity to explore all the reasons why Oklahoma succeeded. So I very much hope that you can join us on that occasion. Now, here's some things you ought to know about our guest this morning, Dr. Alex Chase-Levenson. He is an associate professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania. He's an expert on the history of travel, on the politics and culture of modern Britain and the British Empire. He knows a tremendous amount about the relationship between travel and public health. He is the author of an important book called The Yellow Flag: Quarantine and Britain's Mediterranean from 1780 to 1860. Dr. Chase-Levenson received his PhD from Princeton University, and it is now my great pleasure to turn the program over to him.
Thank you so much, Dick, for that really nice introduction. It's so exciting to hear events are returning in person. It's also, pretty exciting to be giving this presentation today about travel when that's just starting to become possible once more after a terribly difficult and upsetting year and a half. And while I'm not actually going to be talking particularly much about the relationship between travel and disease in the presentation I'm making today, that's a relationship that's at the heart of my own research and my book, and it's something we can get at in the question period if you like, and I'll touch briefly on quarantine a little bit in the middle of this presentation. Okay, so I'm going to try to share my screen and fingers crossed this goes reasonably well. Let's see if I say play from start. Hopefully everybody can see both me and this PowerPoint, which we'll be moving through now. Okay, so the 19th century is really a particularly fantastic period to study because it's one in which so many of the systems, practices, assumptions, ideas, and phenomena we take for granted now came into being in a recognizable way for the first time. That's absolutely the case with leisure travel, with mass tourism. The kinds of things people did or sought out while abroad, the kinds of travel literature they read, the kinds of people doing the traveling all changed drastically between the French Revolution and the First World War. So 1789 and 1914 are bookends for today and what historians typically call the long 19th century. Why should British travel in particular interest us? In some ways, there's simply the valuability and humor in many British travel narratives, but there are lots of reasons in broader terms that one might be interested in this, from the influence British culture and British entrepreneurs had globally, and particularly from our own geographic setting on American culture of the time, from the way in which many traditions of mass tourism began in Britain, to the way new technologies of travel, such as the railway and the steamship, were initially pioneered in Britain. And the other reason, of course, concerns the British Empire. Britain was the global hegemon of its era, and the encounters between its citizens and others in the world were particularly freighted, often brutal and often very troubling. So travel exists, it's not the same as imperialism, but it does run along many of the same currents. Also, the global reach and maritime focus of British power meant there were simply a very large number of Britons turning up in very unusual and apparently inaccessible places at various times. And I'm talking today predominantly about leisure travel, but if any people in the audience are interested in other forms of travel, we can talk about that too later. So I want to start with a figure who wasn't British at all. That would be the Bohemian aristocrat Count Leopold von Berchtold, a friend and associate of the British agricultural reformer Arthur Young, who was traveling in Britain in the fateful revolutionary year of 1789, and turned his mind in that year to a question that had nothing to do with politics or revolutions or agriculture, as it were, and that was, how can one travel well? Berchtold was steeped in the traditions of the Enlightenment, which portrayed travel as a useful art, as something that was good for society at large and not just the individual traveler. And Berchtold wrote this book, which you see the very dense title page for in the upper corner of the slide, and that would be the Essay to Direct and Extend the Inquiries of Patriotic Travelers. This work proposed exactly 2,443 questions any right-thinking traveler would seek to answer in any foreign land visited, to be compiled, annotated, and published in a way that would increase human knowledge. So it was a core responsibility of the traveler to publish something, some record of his or her travels on the return to the home country. This is a helpful source to think with, Berchtold's work, not because anyone, and I'm pretty sure actually no one went out and wrote a travel narrative that said, right, I've gone to this place and here are the answers to the 2,443 questions. But because even putting things in those terms, as he did, gives us a sense of the social and intellectual culture within which a kind of 18th century mode of amateur dilettantish travel could be seen as a useful endeavor. Berchtold's narrative assumes as a matter of course that a traveler had the funds necessary to undertake a lengthy journey where the answers to all of these questions could be sussed out. One did not sail for weeks, and for most Britons, even most continental European places required a journey of weeks to reach, only to make a journey of a week or even a couple weeks. And most destinations lacked what we would now see as a tourist infrastructure. At the turn of the 19th century. Nothing we would see as a large luxury hotel. Aristocratic travelers would certainly rent very nice rooms, but the prep work involved, even for incredibly elite travelers, and it was all incredibly elite travelers at this point mostly, who were leisure traveling, was infinitely more difficult than it would be now as an ordinary person clicking through Expedia, Orbitz, or hotels.com. A traveler would have to charter a boat, arrange horses and coaches from a port city to a destination, hire local servants, rent furniture, come to settlements with local merchants about supplies of food and wine. And all of this, of course, led to mishaps, misunderstandings, and experiences of roughing it that we would hardly expect from the paintings we see of late Georgian aristocrats. And here we have a couple paintings of very elite aristocratic travelers on their 18th century travels. So perhaps the most famous breed of 18th century travelers had many of these arrangements taken care of for them because of their family connections and very powerful parents. And these would be the famous grand tourists, people undertaking the grand tour, usually young noble sons, dispatched to spend up to a year. The grand tours could range from around 6 months to 2 years, very long period of time. Time spent on the continent, learning French and possibly Italian, touring sites British tastemakers saw as essential to cultivating the proper elite culture of their great and good. And that was predominantly Paris, Venice, and Rome, but many other locales as well. Aristocrats were usually accompanied by some kind of chaperone, a poorer family member perhaps, on a grand tour, but were obviously expected to enjoy themselves and cultivate their minds at the same time. So the grand tour was kind of designed to be both, to some extent, debaucherous, but also educational. In the 19th century, as conventional itineraries opened up to new horizons, we see young aristocratic men venturing farther and farther afield. And this can show us how even for grand tourists, travel was much more intense and difficult than any elites certainly experience today. So you could take an example from my own research, where I discovered the story of Henry Anson, the ill-fated Henry Anson, and John Fox Strangeways, Anson, the son of a viscount, Fox Strangeways, the son of an earl, grand tourists both, who were traveling together, and in 1827 went as far as Aleppo in modern Syria, then in the Ottoman Empire. There, as intrepid grand tourists were wont to do, and with all the daring do they associated with the heroic and famous celebrity travelers of their time, Anson and Fox Strangeways tried to have an adventure. Unfortunately for them, the adventure they chose was to dress up as local Muslims and attend a service at a local mosque. This was expressly against the law for many cities in the Ottoman Empire. Anson and Fox Strangeways' disguise were apparently not very successful. Ottoman authorities were rather annoyed, imprisoned both of these young men. The young men later, though not subsequent accounts by their families, claimed they were briefly enslaved. And then Anson and Fox Strangeways escaped to flee to the house of the French consul to Aleppo, and Matthew de Lesseps, who is, I believe, the grandfather of the engineer of the Suez Canal. So a prominent French diplomat houses these people. They apparently have reached safety when Anson promptly dies of bubonic plague, which he is picked up in prison, and seriously freaks out the entire community of Europeans residing in Aleppo. So you can see, for even this incredibly elite set of people, they're both undertaking things that are dangerous, one might say stupid, and also having experiences that are far from what we might expect from a kind of fun jaunt to continental Europe that we associate with grand tours. This is a change. Going as far as the Ottoman Empire is definitely a change. It's only something that became common into the 19th century. One can certainly detect in such attempts to enter mosques, and especially with such episodes as the famous mid-Victorian traveler, Sir Richard Francis Burton's disguised participation in the pilgrimage to Mecca, very much a kind of almost overt quasi-colonial attitude. But one can also find hints of Berchtold in all of this, with travel as something that was not supposed to be simply easy or always fun, but was about discovery, about accessing things which are forbidden and transmitting stories about them to a wider audience. It's supposed to be useful to the extent that it gets that there's an object to it, that it unveils something for readers back home. So, I hope you're getting a sense of the way in which, even though a very, very narrow sliver of the public is actually traveling, because of travel literature and because of the kind of philosophy of travel at the time, this is supposed to be something that affects a much wider swath of society than just the aristocratic men doing the traveling. to see this unusual blend of personal enjoyment, potential debauchery, and a desire to use travel to enlighten the masses, we can turn to one of the most unexpected 18th century places, and that would be the famous naughty Hellfire Club, or more appropriately than that, its respectable Dr. Jekyll-like alter ego, which shared almost all of the same members, including Francis Dashwood, who we see here dressed as an Italian monk, and Hellfire Club members were all about kind of creating bizarre rituals, dressing in kind of Renaissance Italian clothing, and engaging in debaucherous orgies, of which stories only came out later. You know, maybe in reality they're kind of much less tame, much more tame than the name sort of suggests. But what is interesting from our purposes is that the members of the Hellfire Club were almost all the same as the members of the Society of Dilletanti, a group of aristocrats. The rule for membership was both, some kind of elite background and, that you've returned from the Grand Tour. So they're self-consciously cultured people who are obsessed with the European continent, come back to Britain, and there they kind of sponsor further research and interest, both artistic and historic, and all in many other ways, into the continent. And it's also about publicizing kind of fashion. We have the infamous, or the famous 18th century stereotype of the macaroni, very well known from the song Yankee Doodle Dandy, sticking a feather in his cap and calling it macaroni. Well, that refers to people who came back from the Grand Tour and are self-consciously trying to flaunt European fashions, are called macaronis. This was a very kind of condescending, it's supposed to make fun of them, phrase in 18th century caricature. So we have, I think, this very funny cartoon on the right here entitled, "What is this, my son Tom?" Where a kind of sturdy, salt of the earth British squire is encountering his foppish son and poking at his ostentatious wig with his riding whip. But what's interesting so despite the fact that the Society of Dilletanti and macaronis in 18th century culture are often made fun of, this group is incredibly influential in terms of kind of formulating a basis for British aesthetic theory, our understandings of what is artistically good and beautiful, and also in kind of spurring along future travel and interest in other parts of the world. So, for example, British Philhellenism, and Philhellenism is a major current in Victorian British culture, and in kind of political ways, actually support for the Greek uprising in the 1820s, when the Greeks carve out a fledgling nation state from the Ottoman Empire. This is turbocharged. The British support for this is turbocharged by a set of travels the Society of Dilletanti pays for of two British artists to go through Greece and make sketches of various sculpture and publish this when returning to Britain. This becomes very influential. It influences British artistic theory. And again, we see from this that travel is not just a marginal concern, and it's not just elites. By the kind of turn of the 19th century, elites are often funding or sponsoring, employing many others who go abroad. I mean, just thinking of servants alone, any kind of grand tourist is outnumbered by people from a much less elite background on the journey. Okay, so what we see by the Napoleonic Wars and the onset of the 19th century proper is both a huge expansion of the number of Britons who, for reasons of war and diplomacy, were fanned out across Europe, and for various reasons, the new ability for at least moderately adventurous tourists to venture further, as we saw from the Anson Strangeways experience. Egypt, under its new Pasha Muhammad Ali, became a major site for more adventurous tourists. And this kind of travel went far beyond just the aristocracy. Professional artists, authors, lawyers, colonial officials, numerous diplomats, their families, merchants, transshippers, a huge range of still, solidly middle or upper middle class people move around the continent and the Middle East in new numbers. For non-elite travelers, booking a bed on a ship rather than chartering a yacht was a much more affordable option to get outside of Britain. And by the 1830s, we see the foundation of regular passenger ship routes on steamships that carry larger and larger numbers of passengers from a somewhat wider set of backgrounds. Mostly we could think of the P&O, the Peninsular and Oriental Company. Precursors to this go back to the 1820s, or actually maybe the 18 teens, in fact, and by the 1830s and 40s, it's sponsoring regular routes across continental Europe and the Mediterranean. We could think about larger hotels, which start to develop both in European cities like Nice or Paris, catering primarily to British tourists, but even as far away as Cairo, where Shepherd's Hotel, founded in 1841, is so associated with British tourists in Egypt that it was originally referred to by many as the Hôtel des Anglais, the British hotel, English hotel. In a similar way, British tourists and expatriates in Nice were so numerous by the early 19th century that they formed an Anglican church and undertook funds for building a new pathway along Nice's waterfront, which has evolved into the main arterial road along Nice's waterfront today, appropriately called the Promenade des Anglais. This post-Napoleonic Wars British imprint on the continent and Mediterranean region was confirmed just before the end of the conflict in 1814 with the foundation of a new newspaper, a very unique one called Galignani's Messenger. Galignani's Messenger was printed twice a day in its peak years. It was printed in Paris at the Librairie du Galignani on the Rue de Rivoli. It had a press on the Rue Vivienne, but Galignani's Messenger is printed in English, and it employed a range of translators who basically surveyed every day the major British newspapers and also the major newspapers in France, the Italian states, the German states, the Habsburg Empire, and even sometimes the Ottoman Empire, and provide a digest of this news, little paragraphs that are kind of copying from the major news articles in all these newspapers every day to British expatriates anywhere in the continent. And you could subscribe to this. You might be a little late getting to you, but it would be a way of remaining mostly in touch with news going on both at home and abroad. You can see in this example I have, it always started with Great Britain. London, May 17th, 1817. It tells you what were the major political disputes, also court drama, elite gossip, and then the next section was always France, and it tells you what's going on. So it's a newspaper that kind of fosters a cosmopolitan British type. And it makes normalized the sense to which there would be a class, a culture of British people traveling around who are interested in this kind of thing. And it's a sizable enough number of people by this kind of post-Napoleonic period, 18 teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, who are interested enough to subscribe to this to make it a viable concern. Galignani's interestingly lasted until 1904. So another change in this period was more intangible. And to move very quickly through a vast amount of cultural history, we could kind of distill this into an idea that across numerous genres, after the Napoleonic Wars and kind of during them, we see a move away from Enlightenment era certainty and universality in favor of a new focus on individuality and subjectivity. This is associated with romanticism, certainly, but very specifically when it comes to consuming heritage, historic monuments, foreign sites. We could think of this as a kind of set of concerns that some very perceptive historians have called the affective turn. So there's a new interest not on going through and ticking off boxes and saying, yes, there's this major site, this major site, this major site, and I'm going to tell you the history of all of them, and much more in saying, here are my own emotional responses to these well-known sites. This leads to a change not just in the kinds of sites people want to visit, but also very much in the kinds of travel narratives people are reading, and thus the kind of travel they think is interesting, fun, and exciting when consumers back home are reading travel accounts. So in essence, and with plenty of exceptions, the focus of many travel narratives began to move away from this effort to catalog, the effort to answer thousands of questions that people like Berchtold were saying, this is necessary, and to be much more about the writer's emotions. Around the same time, it became quite common for authors to preface travel narratives with things like an author's apology, because there's such an explosion of travel literature in this period, a golden age really for travel literature, sites that are favored for travel account writing and travels that, become very popular in lots of travel narratives. So travelers have to say, here's what makes my account unique. And it's usually about your own personal relationship to the sites you're visiting. So one can think of this period from roughly the 1815 to the 1850s as a sort of middle period. Travel still took a lot of planning, featured relatively little infrastructure, and was mostly off limits to the working classes and lower middle classes. After all, a majority of early Victorians, a surprisingly high percentage, died within 6 miles of the town in which they were born, and a shockingly high percentage never visited London, let alone Paris or Rome, Alexandria or Istanbul. Those who did venture abroad often wrote with a tone of surprise about what they encountered. Package tours were unknown. Even though destinations were becoming more well-known through travel narratives, it was still the case that you would expect the unexpected and feel yourself to be surprised and kind of overwhelmed by travel in a way that was probably less likely in the later decades of the 19th century, when we have charter companies taking huge numbers of tourists to the same sites. So a period that's still very different from our own traveling landscape. But as I said, I'd get to at the beginning, one similarity with our own traveling world in the summer of 2021 is the way in which quarantine regulations made travel very difficult. And that's the subject of my book. So 14-day COVID quarantines would have struck adventurous early Victorians as essentially a picnic compared to the Mediterranean quarantine system, based on a fear of bubonic plague, which we know from Henry Anson's fate was still a problem in various cities in the Middle East. The last bubonic plague outbreak in Western Europe was in 1720, so we have this kind of divergence epidemiologically speaking. But for the most part, many cities in the Ottoman Empire experienced a plague epidemic maybe only once every 30 or in some cases 40 or 50 years and were in perfectly good health. Nevertheless, the quarantine rules said that every traveler, every ship, every letter, every trade good, everything moving from the Middle East to Western Europe had to be quarantined. And these quarantines lasted, in cases of no reports of disease, maybe 3 weeks, to in cases of a case of plague actually on the ship, 80 to 90 days. The fumigation of bodies, even of very elite travelers, the dipping of each letter in vinegar. And you can still, if you go to an archive today, you find a letter that was sent from the Middle East to Western Europe before 1853 or so. It still smells of vinegar because there were really no exceptions to this quarantine system. Not for major British celebrities, for example, who experienced it. Lord Byron and William Thackeray, Moses Montefiore and Benjamin Disraeli, Walter Scott. All of these people undertake quarantine in Malta, a British colony after the Napoleonic Wars, the largest lazaretto or quarantine site in the Mediterranean. I dwell on this not just because it's something I know about from my own research, but because this kind of shows us features of this middle period of travel that I think are important. So that list of celebrities can show, okay, Lord Byron is the only aristocrat at this time. While Disraeli was eventually ennobled, not at this point in his life. We see authors who are kind of using their travels as a way to write books, painters as a kind of occasion to paint and use that to burnish their professional credibility. So you could kind of blend leisure travel and work for a more middle class group of travelers. We also see travel is really difficult. An ordinary working class person, obviously, and even many middle class people do not have the time to be quarantined for 40 days in an uncomfortable lazaretto that can only be made more comfortable if you have a lot of money to pay for renting furniture. So again, a kind of middle period where the clientele of travelers is expanding, but not that dramatically yet. And we can take as a great representative of this time period a guy named Alexander Kinglake, who is an early Victorian barrister. Later, he was the author of a very well-regarded, compendious, weighty history of the Crimean War of the 1850s, but he was also a man who traveled in his late 20s, so in the mid-1830s, throughout Europe and the Middle East, and wrote one of the most popular travel narratives of the entire century, and that would be Eothen, or Traces of Travel in the East, its subtitle. Kinglake delighted in unusual encounters, or encounters that he felt were unusual. So his feelings on first seeing men dressed in turbans, his response to unusual desert scenery or quiet oases, jokes that he hears. But when he came to discuss more conventional and famous sites, his readers would already have a kind of mental image of, like the Great Pyramid of Giza that we see. Sure, here are some other much later Victorian travelers encountering the Pyramid of Giza. Kinglake was incredibly disdainful. He admonished his reader, now try to endure this homely, sick nurse-ish illustration of the effect produced upon one's mind by the mere vastness of the Great Pyramid. All told, Kinglake sought to burnish his own image as a sardonic, world-weary man of experience by informing readers that much of the world they sought to explore could in fact be reduced to domestic equivalents they knew well. It is entirely possible, he assures readers, to become a man about town in Jerusalem, and one soon felt so familiar with the holy city that, quote, your club is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where everybody meets everybody every day. Your Bond Street is the Via Dolorosa. So travel for Kinglake became a kind of retrospectively performative exercise in self-fashioning, and saying, aren't I cool and suave and debonair and sardonic to have become such a man about town in a place like Jerusalem, using that to make himself seem more impressive. He tells us, for example, that during his response to a plague epidemic in Istanbul lent a mysterious and exciting feeling to his stay in that city. Well, frankly, I think we have pretty good reason to doubt that. Kinglake's traveling companion actually caught the plague and survived, but still, I doubt that at the time Kinglake felt so suave and cool about the plague as he retrospectively said he was. Travelers like Kinglake still owed a debt to an earlier era where travel was more about cataloging, heavy on detail, and still focused on making travel into a useful art. But the move away from abstract, rigid categories of taste and value to a new focus on emotional responses to visiting particular sites can be seen as a kind of precondition for the development of mass tourism in the decades that follow. So if you don't have a sense that you need to master all the works of the great travelers, to have read the classical authors about their travels, to know not only French and Italian, but possibly Greek and Latin, or as some travelers did, Arabic or Turkish. No, in fact, these travelers are writing in such a way that says, well, what matters is your emotional response and your own ideas and your kind of experiences. And that kind of framing of travel makes it seem more accessible to a wider audience. As early as the 1830s, the prominent Scottish publisher John Murray began to recruit famous authors and scholars to write very popular travel guides to major destinations. These books were typically a combination of historical information about the sites to be visited, much more so than would be normal today, references to great works of literature, but also some information about traveling practicalities. So we can see, again, a kind of middle period. It was from the John Murray Guidebook to Egypt, written not by an employee of this kind of publishing company, but by the famous early Egyptologist J.G. Wilkinson, that I first discovered the quarantine system. So the entire first chapter of that guidebook, published in 1844, was about how to negotiate quarantine in Malta on your way back to Britain. The details do tell you some kind of particular information. So Wilkinson includes, for example, how much a beefsteak cost if you ordered it from the Lazaretto restaurant in Malta. And it mentions a few well-known hotels in Cairo and Alexandria, but it does not go on about local shops and restaurants. It has comments such as, it would be a very nice thing to do to rent a dahabia and a boat on the Nile and, swan down it in a peaceful manner. However, it would simply say, consult a prominent local about this. It would not give you a list of boat rental companies or their opening hours at all. In fact, no opening hours, not for restaurants, shops, hotels, tourist sites, nothing like that is included in a Murray guidebook. This is based on a sense, even in this period, that leisure travelers who could go overseas would proceed with some amount of intrepidness, with enormous financial means, with patience, and with the sense that information could be gained by conversations among gentlemen, by finding one's feet, by visiting the great and good, the elites in the place you visited. Letters of introduction had huge currency at this time. from elites back in Britain to elites you might meet abroad. So these would say, this is a person to be trusted, you can count on them. And it's important to note that when travel began to democratize, it was predominantly through charter companies and tour groups that solidly middle class or much later working class people could go abroad, because charter companies take care of these arrangements and obviate the need for any kind of family connections or letters of introduction, which less elite travelers obviously could not provide. So in ushering along a kind of new period of mass tourism after the 1850s, several factors are key. One is the relative peace, with a few exceptions, on the European continent between 1815 and 1914. The growth of tourist infrastructure, certainly in terms of hotels, pensions, and guest houses. The syncing up between the British railway network and ferry timetables across the English Channel. The rise of tourist entrepreneurs like Thomas Cook in Britain or Louis Stangen on the continent. Such figures took care of almost all arrangements, began to run their own ships, made contracts with particular hotels, and set pricing schemes that put leisure travel in reach of many within the middle class, as well as elites. Cook tours by the 1870s featured a flotilla of some, well, you only see 5 here, but I believe they had 14 Nile steamers in their Nile flotilla, which can tell you the scale at which some of this tourism is occurring by the 1870s. So we are far, far away from the era of EasyJet or Ryanair very, very cheaply taking you to a huge range of countries from Britain. And a Cook's tour to the Eastern Mediterranean would still take a month or two. So no one with regular employment could easily do this. But the numbers did grow. And the domestication and comfort of this world reduced the spontaneity and individuality of earlier tours as they ironed out the difficulties. Jerusalem and Cairo, complained the novelist William Thackeray, are now as familiar to us as Paris and Rome were to our fathers. Over-tourism began to be a problem that many later Victorian elites complained about. So I've said relatively little so far about domestic British travel, but it's there that you really do see a truly mass tourist infrastructure growing in the same time, the mid to late 19th century, that really did cater to lower, middle, and working class clienteles. So proximity and ease made this possible, but the key developer of domestic tourist infrastructure was, of course, the railroad. So if the steamship shaved several days off common sea itineraries, railroads struck those who watched their development as an utterly seismic change, totally different from the stagecoach. Well, every other earlier form of transportation made you, compared to a railroad, you felt the landscape. So if you're traveling in a storm on a stagecoach, as we see in this illustration, you feel the horses rear up and stop potentially as they're freaked by lightning. You feel them straining as you go up a hill. You feel the carriage wheels bump as you go over rocky landscape. By train, you glided through the landscape utterly indifferent to these constraints. You were pulled forward by steam alone, as if most passengers felt by magic. Journeys that had once taken days or even weeks were transformed into a matter of hours. A phrase you hear all over the mid-19th century about railroads is the annihilation of space and time. People expressed a feeling that cities were literally falling into each other because it became so fast to move between them. And with relatively cheap fares, rail travel opened new vistas to a domestic British audience, really starting in, the first decades of the Victorian period. After all, we need to remember that not only were the first railways built in Britain, but that the network there grew much, much faster than anywhere else in the world at that time. So already by 1840, as we can see in these maps, you could take a train. You have a kind of national network developing, at least in England, if not Scotland and Wales, that allows you to take a train from London all the way up to Liverpool, to Manchester, to Birmingham, and to Newcastle. Whereas in continental Europe, you maybe can take a few very short rail journeys. A bit of a national network is emerging in the Low Countries, but nothing like we see in Britain. The railway lay behind the development of numerous British areas into holiday destinations, as did other 19th century trends. So the legacy of Romanticism certainly, and its superstar celebrity poets like William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge turned the Lake District into a major tourist area in the late 19th century. And many of the most iconic and beautiful pathways that we think of, now if you go visit the Lake District, are starting to be built in the Victorian period when this infrastructure is first laid out and when the train first goes as far as Windermere, and you could get right off the train and onto a local ship. There is a way in which there's a kind of new effort to paint many of these landscapes and ideas as existing from some kind of time immemorial space. So if you visit the Lake District now and go to the small town, of Grasmere, you will see all this tourism based around Grasmere gingerbread, which is presented as this kind of time-honored delicacy dating back centuries. Turns out to be invented by one poor housewife named Sarah Nelson in 1854. It's kind of new creation to be traditional and ye old, even in the Victorian period itself. Something similar really happened with Scotland, where we see in part brought on by Queen Victoria and Prince Albert's purchase of Balmoral Castle, a new kind of romance of the Scottish Highlands, and a new focus of tourism there. So the railway, in so many ways, when you're thinking about destinations like the Lake District or like Scotland, but really even more when you're thinking of beach towns in southern England or little quaint villages, brings about holiday destinations in a new way. And the holiday itself, as opposed to the really lengthy journey abroad by elites, really is only a creation of the later 19th century. It's certainly, again, from this period that we get the very idea of a beach town in the first place. And if you can believe it, Britain does indeed have these things. So consider the small town of Torquay, a beautiful seaside town in the southwest of England, nice pubs, British flag bunting everywhere, pretty beaches, a historic steam railway. There's an aspect to visiting Torquay today, I found at least, that is very much about Victorian kitsch. And that's appropriate because Torquay is really a Victorian boomtown, as it was discovered as a tourist destination and reachable by train. So it goes from 800 inhabitants in 1801 to more than 12,000 by the 1850s. And this is really brought along by the railway reaching Torquay, which it does in the 1850s. And the Torquay's railway station is located right, so as you get off, you're surrounded by palm trees and the sea is right there. This area is dubbed the English Riviera. It's about creating a kind of quasi-continental experience for people who don't have the time or the money to leave Britain itself. Let's think about one more Victorian British tourist destination of a different type, and that is Blackpool. On the northwest coast of England, the industrial north, and Blackpool itself is quite close to both the massive port city of Liverpool and the even more massive industrial megalopolis of Manchester. Not the most propitious geographical situation for a beautiful beach resort, one might imagine, but this was an incredibly successful one. So like Torquay, the population of the area boomed. Blackpool was tiny in the 1801 census. It had 500 people. By 1900, the population was 47,000. So the population of Britain overall, multiplied maybe by 2.5 times in the course of the 19th century. That's a lot, but it's way, way less than the rate of increase we see in these new holiday destination towns. Unlike Torquay, this rapid growth is kind of managed by a few particular entrepreneurs who start building holiday cottages and self-consciously trying to make Blackpool into a tourist city, very much aimed at all classes, including very much the working classes. The arrival of the railway in the 1840s spurred this along. Blackpool's promenade was completed in the 1870s and 80s. Blackpool Tower, which you see looming in the background in this slide, was built to resemble the Eiffel Tower in 1894 because why not? We're on holiday and let's try to feel a little bit like we're visiting Paris. These kinds of destinations weren't set up for months and months of residence. You can't do a whole lot in Blackpool. but they're a place where you can spend a very enjoyable 2 or 3 days. The word weekend, for example, very interestingly, comes into the English language in print for the first time in exactly these decades. In, I believe, 1874 is the first printed use of the word weekend, as more and more employers pushed along by labor unions are starting to give workers Saturdays off as well. And that makes leisure tourism for the working classes, particularly to places like Blackpool, popular. Well, this became such an iconic site of working class tourism, not only because of its location in Northern England, but because holidays there actually took on an official structure. By the last decades of the Victorian period, it became common for employers in most northern industrial towns to do their annual machine refurbishments in synchronization, giving workers a week off of holiday time. This was called a wakes week. Entire towns en masse would then decamp off into Blackpool, with railways adding trains to their schedule to accommodate this. And some employers actually financed it. So particularly Bass's Brewery, which was the largest beer brewing business in the world in the late 19th century. It's located in the industrial town of Burton-on-Trent in Staffordshire. It financed for all of its employees annual Bass's excursions to different beach towns around Britain, Blackpool most consistently, but also Brighton and Great Yarmouth. One can look at this history and begin to wonder whether modern mass tourism emerged from earlier aristocratic travel, or whether it emerged more from the traditions of this working class travel, which you could argue was entirely different, more about short holidays and brought along by changes in working hours, growing wealth, and the railway boom. But there are reasons to be skeptical about this. One is that the whole set of tourist paraphernalia we see developing in cities like Torquay, where you not only can get tea on the green, but also go to the beach and explore the caves and go to the museum, blends enjoyment and personal improvement in a way that we clearly see going back as far as travel and tourism in the 18th century. The idea going strong in an era obsessed with Instagram and the word I despise, influencers, in formulating one's own travel, many people's travel itineraries today is not so different from mid-Victorian guidebooks, which gave you recommended reading lists of great travelers you should read and base your own journeys after these examples. So again, travel and tourism might be at a different scale now. It might be turbocharged, but it still is following a lot of the patterns we saw in general. Last thing I want to say is there's a kind of pathos in ending with these slides showing mass tourism in these British beach towns, because after the 1950s, after the kind of new possibility of traveling to continental Europe, even for working class people, the ease of that, cheap airfare, these towns really went through a long period of decline and depression. And they're experiencing right now a kind of COVID boom. Because of the kind of limits on international travel. Blackpool, Torquay, once again are sold out and are briefly going through a reversion to their Victorian heyday. So I'll stop there, and I really look forward to your questions on any parts of any of this. Okay. So the first question I have from Madeleine Perucci was, Jane Austen once horrified at having to live in reduced circumstances at Blackpool. So Blackpool, before the kind of mid-Victorian boom, before the later 19th century, is not in any way a kind of depressed or depressing place. It is, a vaguely scenic town on the coast. Jane Austen spent, most of her time in Bath, which was a very genteel city and kind of maybe the earliest domestic British site of tourism, because it was developed in the early 18th century as a place not great aristocrats, but kind of the lower gentry and upper middle class could go to for genteel fun. And in a lot of things you could do at Bath, take the waters, go to the baths, go to the tea rooms, have dances, assemblies, that kind of thing is replicated at many of these beach towns that are created for a more mass audience later in the century. So I don't think particularly any kind of stigma that the way British people now might react if you said Blackpool and the kind of, who wants to go on holiday there anymore kind of feeling, that's obviously, that is not something that that I think Jane Austen, could have felt at the time. Although, it also wasn't a destination you would feel particularly proud of in the early 19th century either. question from Edward Shapson, and I'm so sorry if I'm butchering anybody's name. What about pleasure cruising? How did this sort of elite travel evolve? How did this sort of travel evolve from the elites to the masses? Pleasure cruising? Well, I'm not totally sure, what you mean by that, but obviously the masses can't afford a yacht of their own. But taking, the idea of seeing the voyage itself as part of the fun, and as part of what travel was about, does go back, to the Victorian period, and the P&O and Cook's Company really market the kind of shipboard amenities they're providing to tourists. You could get itineraries to the kinds of ports of call and places you are passing on a longer voyage, even for people who aren't traveling for leisure. So if you were going out to India, as hundreds of thousands of Britons did during this period when India is the jewel in Britain's imperial crown, your voyage out would be marked by all these sites you expect to see along the way. Question from Joan Marco: did tourism to the continent result in much emigration? It is really interesting that there are these kind of expatriate British communities that develop in continental ports at over the late 18th and early 19th century. I've worked a lot on this because the people I see showing up in quarantine quite a lot are these people. So you do have a small British community, even in cities like Aleppo or Cairo or Alexandria or Istanbul, but and a kind of older established British merchant community in places like Livorno, in Italy, certainly in Rome, Naples, Venice, absolutely. I don't really think, some travelers do kind of get captivated by these cities and want to move there. And that became, there are kind of rest cures suggested for tuberculosis and other kind of ailments that suggest you should go relocate for a long time to Southern Europe. But large-scale emigration from Britain, which is at a peak in the 19th century, is mostly to the United States and to the colonies of settlement in the empire: Canada, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. Question from William Reiner: could you touch on how travel became increasingly available for women during this period, particularly further abroad than Europe? This is a great question. Especially because a lot of the most evocative and interesting travel narratives are written by women. So, and women not necessarily who are solo travelers. So one of the ones I've used the most because it is very evocative about quarantine, it is written by the wife of a mid-range colonial official who was in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. They traveled back across Egypt to the Mediterranean, then were quarantined in Malta, then took another steamship to Britain. And Mrs. Griffiths, as this author is very kind of voluble about her experiences. For solo female travelers, travel is much, much more difficult. One interesting woman who traveled by herself in this period is, or without a husband, is Florence Nightingale, the famous, future nurse who traveled with family friends to Egypt, Greece, and Italy. And she wrote a really evocative and interesting set of letters. We see it's much easier in a way for her to travel actually by herself, more when she has a professional reason to, when she's embedded in the British Army fighting the Crimean War, than it is earlier, because there's simply not, for elite women, a social space to be by yourself utterly abroad in the way there was for men. And that is something that does change, especially for very rich women, by the very end of the 19th century. You could think of someone like the Egyptologist, the funder of much Egyptology, the philanthropist Amelia Edwards, who traveled down the Nile and wrote a travel narrative like that. Or down on the lower end of the spectrum, you see kind of British colonial subjects. Maltese women, for example, traveling as seasonal workers across the Mediterranean. But, as in so many ways for more elite women in this period, it's just, there's not a social space to be by yourself, especially abroad. Are there any, a question from Cheryl Shapiro that is interesting. Are there records of how the locals regarded English travelers? Were they welcomed or resented? Well, this interesting dynamic when we think about the way American travelers are often treated or thought about in some places these days. Yeah, people do resent British travelers in some places, especially since British travelers do, the focus of a lot of travel narratives, as you find from comments people make now, is about let's go abroad to compare what we see there negatively with how great it is at home. Even kind of elite and very culturally aware people like Matthew Arnold, the Victorian intellectual, spent his travelogue of going through the German states complaining about such things as the inadequate construction of German beds and the heavy food. And you can imagine if locals heard any of this, they were certainly going to complain. The British, very elite British people certainly could speak French and sometimes Italian, but the kind of linguistic barriers, the way English is kind of an alien language to the Mediterranean basin, at least, compared to French and Italian, which were more well known, that could also generate some resentment too. I have a question from Shannon. Wait, is there a relation between quarantine locations and travel health? Oh, that's a great question. Specifically the healthy climates that Europeans sought closer to the sea. Quarantine was incredibly controversial. There's a group of radical doctors who call themselves anti-contagionists, who believe that epidemic diseases like the plague did not spread person to person. And in fact, now we know they spread largely through rats and fleas. But these anti-contagionists believed it was atmosphere. They thought quarantine was useless. And this argument really suits free trader kind of reformers who want to end this kind of delay and expense and just get everything to their location as fast as possible. So quarantine is expensive and controversial. And one of the ways people try to criticize it is by saying all the places where lazarettos are actually very unhealthy, so that it's not only useless, but it's counterproductive to health. In a kind of sad way, I have some letters, I read some letters from the employees at Britain's own quarantine station, Stangate Creek, off the Kentish coast, where some radical doctors come down right when quarantine is being taken apart at the end of the 1840s. And the doctors, who are these elite members of the General Board of Health, say, oh, it looks very unhealthy around here. And surely you've had numerous cases of pneumonia every year. And the quarantine officials say, in fact, we've never had any case of this that we know. We see where you're going with these kinds of questions, and that's not good. But as you're pointing out, it's kind of hypocritical, because many of the cities in which lazarettos were in fact the same places people might go for rest cures. This kind of arguing is something that was going on, something people were particularly defensive or offensive about in the 19th century itself. Okay, lots more questions. Really sorry if I don't end up getting to yours, but these are all really interesting things to think about. Question from Richard Margolis. Any additional comments about the impact of Richard Burton's extensive exploratory travels? Well, Richard Burton is an incredibly interesting figure. If you're interested in reading more about him, the biography by Dane Kennedy, The Highly Civilized Man, is a really wonderful biography, that syncs up to kind of some pretty interesting history with Richard Burton. Yeah, he's a really interesting guy for thinking about the way in which travel relates to imperialism, the way in which kind of class is kind of performed through the sorts of things one does on tour, through actually spurring along British imperial interest in various parts of the Middle East that comes to matter more later during World War I and after. So Richard Burton, I think, is very interesting. And he also is influential in sponsoring a new anthropological society that is very much implicated in some pretty problematic racial views. So yeah, the way in which even this kind of travelers who we might think of as cosmopolitan in some ways actually end up kind of hardening racial and political boundaries in the course of what they're doing, I think is something, very much to be aware of. Question from Mike Speedling. What do we know about European travel for education or pleasure in classical and medieval times? Was travel only for traders and pilgrims? Well, this is I am married to a medievalist, so I should know more about this, but in fact, I don't know how much I can say. There are obviously famous travelers and explorers in the medieval period, emissaries, messengers, diplomats, all this kind of thing of people who travel, pilgrims, absolutely. there are forms of migration in all of these periods. Yeah, so but in terms of travel for pleasure, this is not something that really becomes a tradition, I'd say, until the 17th and 18th centuries, when it becomes a normal kind of feature of aristocratic life. One thing that does happen in the medieval and early modern periods is royal courts themselves moved around countries in order to maintain kind of influence in different parts of the country. And that is a way in which you do get elites traveling a lot. From an earlier period, you had the tradition of aristocratic families having a country house and also a city house. So that's a form of travel that predates the Victorian period. But people can move, obviously, for lots of reasons, and especially when one broadens one's gaze from just leisure travel to all forms of movement, this becomes a truly enormous field. Absolutely. Question or comment. Yeah, very interesting comment from Hilary Brindley. Interesting to see travel influencing places and naming things back home, like Little Venice in London, an area where a couple canals meet, or Swiss Cottage, or Little Switzerland in the Derbyshire Peak District. Absolutely, absolutely. This kind of, and that's the same tradition with naming Torquay, the center of the English Riviera, taking continental kind of vibes and trying to apply them, as in Derbyshire, to local landscapes. Definitely, that's true. And it shows the kind of cultural cachet many of these places have in the domestic British landscape. Yeah, so it's interesting to see how kind of far back this kind of sense of Britain having a bit of a chip on its shoulder in cultural terms, certainly when it comes to food, with, until very recently, French food being seen by Britons as, the standard to which elites ought to aspire, in other forms of culture as well. Yeah, absolutely. And the sense that local scenery can only kind of mimic or copy foreign scenery, even though in other ways it's obviously the majority, what the majority is doing, domestic tourism. And again, it's kind of interesting to see how there's a kind of new effort to build a sort of patriotism, and that's true not just in Britain but in other countries too, about visiting domestic tourist sites that might seem out of fashion. A question, an anonymous question that's a very important one. How did people go about paying their expenses as they toured? Letters of credit? That's a very good idea, and sometimes that is true. It's interesting that my sense from travel narratives is that the sense that we have about individual countries having specific currencies was much more fungible, obviously, or not obviously, but it was much more fungible in the pre-20th century world, where if you had any kind of silver or gold coin, no matter where it had been minted, it was very likely to be accepted. So even though currencies do vary, very different forms of money are accepted if you actually have that. Travelers probably would have some of that, and yet, yes, also letters of credit. Absolutely important as a way of doing business, specifically when you're dealing with people who are shipping things for you across a long period. And this also made travel risky. These kinds of things are much more uncertain. So it's not that surprising that during the late 18th and 19th centuries is when you see a boom in the insurance business as well, in part to not just for ordinary travelers, but for transnational business interactions. But obviously there's a huge amount of risk involved here. And thank you all for great questions, and thanks for tuning in.